Hi everyone and welcome back. I'm excited to announce that today I'll be taking a deep dive into this wild ride, the Structure Cycleworks SCW-1. Before I continue, it should be noted that this video is sponsored by the great guys over at Structure. However, in my agreement with them, I made sure to point out that I do objective and unbiased reviews, and they still agreed to sponsor it, and for good reason. After riding the bike every day for a week, I came away impressed. The SCW-1 comes with 153mm of rear travel and 154mm up front, and runs 27.5 wheels. But what separates it from its competitors is the 4-bar linkage-driven front end that claims to improve wheel path, provide better small bump compliance, reduce brake dive, and increase stability. Bold claims, which is why I've been intrigued to analyze this bike for months. Before jumping into the front end and looking how it handles the downhill, you first got to get up the mountain. So let me analyze how this bike pedals using anti-squat, which looks at the forces on the rear suspension under acceleration. For the Structure, the anti-squat starts high, between 120 and 135%, and decreases linearly to around 70% at full travel. The lower anti-squat values deeper in the travel result in a plusher ride and a reduction in the overall pedal kickback. At sag, the anti-squat is right around 110%, which typically provides really great pedaling efficiency with no pedal bob. And after climbing close to 3,000 meters in the week I had this bike, I can 100% say that this bike does indeed do just that. I never had the need to use the lockout button in the suspension, despite some really grueling climbs with grades in the mid-20s. So how does the bike handle the downhills? Let's start by looking at two separate but somewhat related elements, anti-rise and anti-dive. The former looking at the rear suspension, and the latter the front suspension, both while braking. The anti-rise hovers right around the mid-40s for the entire travel, which provides a very active suspension that is decoupled and largely unhindered by the braking forces. It also does mean, however, that the rear suspension won't try to keep the bike level during rear braking to counteract the weight transfer forward. Good thing then that this bike has improved anti-dive characteristics compared to a normal telescopic fork. Anti-dive helps to prevent the front end from compressing as easily under braking due to rider weight transfer alone, which provides more travel to help absorb bumps instead. For a normal fork, the anti-dive numbers are all negative, meaning it actually is pro-dive and promotes suspension compression under braking. The SCW-1 by comparison, while not having huge anti-dive numbers in its stock setting, is still significantly better than a telescopic fork. It should be noted that the anti-dive on the SCW-1 can be further increased if one changes a flip chip of sorts on the front end linkage. Is there a negative to too much anti-dive? Well, much like with anti-rise, too much anti-dive makes the front suspension very firm under braking as it tries to resist the weight transfer. So allowing you to tweak the anti-dive allows you to have the front end react how you prefer it. For myself, I left it in the lower setting, and while it definitely did still dive under braking, I didn't really mind it and preferred to have a plusher front end instead. These two clips hopefully provide a good example of how much brake dive still exists in the suspension in its lowest setting. First, my current bike, a Scott Genius LT with 170mm of front travel set up for 30% sag. And now the SCW-1 with its 154mm of front travel also set up with 30% sag. Before diving into what I feel are the defining characteristics of the front suspension design, it's time to just enjoy some ripping around the forest on this fully carbon fiber beast.
Have a good ride.
So what are the things I noticed most about the front suspension design? For sure, stiffness and wheel path. On a regular telescopic fork, everything from the headset down relies on the fork material to prevent it from flexing, and because the fork needs to house all the damping and rebound elements, the wall thickness must be kept in check to ensure that the front end doesn't become ridiculously heavy. The SCW-1 front fork, by comparison, is supported much lower down, resulting in less flex along this shorter length. Additionally, the front forks are carbon fiber and empty, so some more wall thickness could be added to them without having a really heavy front end. As a result, while plying through rock gardens and across roots, the front end stayed noticeably more composed and planted. The second thing I really noticed was the wheel path, which became obvious under hard braking on steep technical sections and on high-speed berms. The wheel path of both the front and rear start very vertical before arcing slowly toward the middle of the bike. The best way to describe what this does to the bike's stability is to use the trail and fork offset measurements of the bike. However, for the SCW-1, I'll need to adapt these slightly to account for the front end not having a traditional linear movement. The greater the trail, the more stable the front end. To start, I draw a line through the steer to the ground at the 66.1 degree head angle. From this, one can calculate the fork offset as being 47 millimeters. If one then draws a vertical line from the axle to the ground, one can calculate the trail as being about 106 millimeters. This is how trail is normally calculated, so no surprises here. With a typical telescopic fork, as you compress both wheels, the trail doesn't change. However, compressing both wheels on the SCW-1, one ends up needing to adjust the head angle slacker in order to keep the same offset, as the wheel actually moves forward compared to a typical linear wheel path. This effective slackening of the head angle results in an increase in trail closer to 122 mm and an increase in general stability of the bike. It also means that you're less likely to go over the bars. A different way to analyze this bike is to compress only the front wheel. For a telescopic fork, the increase in head angle to 74 degrees results in a decrease of trail to only 56 mm from its original 106 mm. The SCW-1, however, using my system of calculating head angle and trail by keeping offset the same, results in a head angle increase to only 71 degrees and a final trail measurement of 70 mm. So overall, still more stable in a telescopic fork. So how did this play out in the trail? One of the biggest things I noticed was not being so far over the front wheel during steep sections, and not having to shift my weight rearward when braking hard in a straight line or just before entering a corner, which allowed me to enter the corner more level and I feel improved traction. The last big thing to cover on this bike is the leverage ratio. In order to get the desired wheel path and fit everything in the front end, the engineers ended up with a leverage ratio of the front that is almost completely linear, between 2.4 and 2.5 for the entire travel. Since they wanted a balanced response between front and rear, this led to a rear leverage ratio also being around 2.4. This was a very interesting choice, as a telescopic fork also has a linear leverage ratio, so the SCW-1 doesn't have any significant advantages when it comes to this particular parameter. It also means that the bike won't benefit from improved small bump compliance or bottom-out support due to the leverage ratio alone and its non-progressive response on both the front and rear end. As a result of this, the suspension relies solely on the two air shocks to provide end stroke support, and thus neither would be suitable for a coil shock. Having said all that, the front end design does have a significant benefit that improves the small bump compliance in a different way: reduced friction. The stanchions of a normal telescopic fork constantly rub against the bushings and seals inside the fork, and the friction only increases when a horizontal load causes the fork to flex and be pushed harder against the bushings. The 4-bar linkage of the SCW-1 causes all horizontal loads to be directed through large bearings instead, which handle radial loads extremely well without significant friction. As a result, the front shock is decoupled from these horizontal forces and only has to contend with the seal friction that results in a much more supple ride. So what are some negatives of the bike overall? The biggest gripe I had with the bike was the lack of a water bottle holder, with a close second being the dual crown front fork that I found limited the turning radius on a couple of really tight corners. I've always had single crown forks, so it was just something I needed to get used to. Talking with Lonnie, the owner of Structure, both of these things seem to be addressed in future bike releases. The last thing that was only really noticeable when I picked up the bike was the weight, despite it being full carbon fiber, as it was about 3 pounds heavier than my aluminum enduro bike. However, once I got heading downhill on the trail, this didn't really matter. Again, Lonnie indicated that he purposely overbuilt the first release of the bike to ensure years of trouble-free riding. Based on this summary, would I buy one? After riding the SCW-1 for a week on a variety of technical black diamonds and some fast flow trails, I can confidently say that this bike is not just marketing hype or just an engineering exercise to reinvent something that ain't broke. There's genuinely some solid engineering behind this bike, and overall I came away impressed and a likely buyer if I was in the market for a new bike. As an added benefit, I also really enjoyed the conversations I had with many other riders while climbing or stopped at trail junctions directly due to the bike's design. It certainly is a talking point.
No, there's no rest for the weary here. Woo.
Thanks for joining me again this week. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video to let me know that you like what I'm doing on the channel. And remember, if you want to help support the channel, make sure to head over to my Patreon page using the link down below. Until next time, happy trails!